The hospital's fluorescent lights flickered faintly as the emergency room buzzed with the usual chaos of a Monday evening. Nurses dashed between patients, doctors shouted orders over the din, and the faint scent of antiseptic hung heavily in the air. It was in the midst of this controlled mayhem that the man entered, a wiry figure in his late 60s, wearing a worn "Make America Great Again" hat. His face was pale, his breathing labored, and his hand clutched his chest as though willing his heart to keep beating. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The triage nurse glanced up as he stumbled through the automatic doors. Her eyes flicked to the bright red hat before landing on his anguished face. "Someone get a wheelchair," she called, her tone clipped. But when the patient collapsed into the nearest chair, her professionalism slipped. She hesitated, her lips tightening into a thin line. Behind her, the hospital's manager, Greta Coleman, watched the scene unfold. Greta was a tall woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and an even sharper sense of right and wrong, or at least her version of it. She prided herself on running the hospital with an iron will, ensuring that every patient received care, but her personal convictions often colored her decisions. The sight of the red hat perched on the man's head set her jaw to clench. "We're full tonight," Greta murmured to the triage nurse. "He might need to wait." "But he's critical," the nurse protested, her gaze darting nervously between Greta and the gasping man. Greta's voice dropped, her tone icy. "We have limited resources. People who promote hate don't get priority here." The nurse flinched but said nothing, her hands trembling as she filled out the intake form. Meanwhile, the man's condition worsened. His skin turned ashen and sweat beaded on his forehead. A few other patients murmured uneasily, sensing something was wrong. "Please," the man rasped, barely audible. "I need help." Greta folded her arms and looked at him coolly. "Sir, there are other patients ahead of you. You'll have to wait your turn." The words stung, but the man's eyes softened, as if he understood something she didn't. He nodded weakly, his gaze scanning the room. He seemed less concerned about his own plight and more interested in the people around him. The frightened child with a broken arm, the elderly woman clutching a walker. Even in his distress, his expression was kind, almost paternal. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The man's breathing grew more labored, his head lolling to one side. Finally, a young doctor named Evan Novak approached, his brow furrowed. Evan had overheard snippets of the exchange and was struggling to contain his frustration. "Greta," he said quietly, pulling her aside. "That man's having a cardiac event. He needs immediate care." Greta's eyes narrowed. "Do you know who he is, or what he stands for?" Evan glanced at the man, then back at Greta. "I know he's a human being in need of medical attention. That's all that matters." Greta's lips thinned further. "This hospital doesn't need a media circus if someone recognizes him. Let's just say his kind doesn't inspire sympathy." Evan stared at her, disbelief etched into his features. "You're letting your personal biases dictate whether someone lives or dies?" She didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. Frustrated, Evan stormed away, vowing to do something, anything to help the patient. Moments later, the man's condition took a sudden turn. His body convulsed, and he slid from the chair onto the cold tile floor. Gasps echoed through the waiting room as nurses rushed to his side, their training overriding any hesitation. Greta stood frozen, her face a mask of indecision. Evan knelt beside the man, barking orders. "Get a crash cart! Start compressions!" As the team worked frantically to revive him, Greta lingered on the sidelines, her heart pounding. She told herself she was right, that this man represented everything wrong with the world. Yet something about the situation gnawed at her, a quiet voice she couldn't quite ignore. After several tense minutes, the man stabilized enough to be wheeled into the ER. Evan stayed by his side, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. They didn't know the man's name. He carried no identification, only the hat. For now, he was a John Doe. Hours passed and the emergency room gradually quieted. Greta tried to focus on her administrative duties, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man. Who was he really? Why had he seemed so familiar? She brushed the questions aside, reminding herself that it didn't matter. People like him didn't deserve her concern. Then, just as the night shift began, everything changed. A black SUV screeched to a halt outside the hospital, its tinted windows reflecting the harsh glare of the streetlights. The doors swung open, and out stepped two sharply dressed men in dark suits. They moved with purpose, their expressions grim. Greta watched, puzzled, as they approached the front desk. "We're here for the patient brought in earlier," one of them said, flashing a badge. "Where is he?" The receptionist stammered, unsure how to respond. Greta stepped forward, her curiosity piqued. "Who are you?" she demanded. The man fixed her with a steely gaze. "We're with the governor's office. That man you just treated? He's Henry Coulson, one of the most influential figures in the state. He's the governor's closest advisor." Greta felt the blood drain from her face. Henry Coulson. The name struck her like a thunderclap. She'd seen him on television countless times, standing quietly in the background during press conferences, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the political storms swirling around him. He was known for his philanthropic work, his efforts to bridge divides, and his uncanny ability to bring people together. And she had almost let him die. The men brushed past her, heading straight for the ER. Greta stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing. She replayed the events of the evening in her head, each decision now tinged with regret. She thought of the kindness in Henry's eyes, the way he had seemed more concerned for others than for himself. She thought of the red hat, and how it had blinded her to the person beneath it. Meanwhile, in the ER, Evan was updating the governor's aides on Henry's condition. "He had a heart attack," Evan explained. "We managed to stabilize him, but it was touch and go for a while. He's resting now." One of the men nodded grimly. "You saved his life. Thank you." Evan's jaw tightened. "It almost didn't happen. Someone tried to delay his care." The aide's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Evan hesitated, glancing toward the door where Greta stood. He didn't need to say anything. The aide followed his gaze and immediately understood. By the time Greta gathered the courage to enter the ER, the room was quiet. Henry lay on a hospital bed, his chest rising and falling steadily. His eyes fluttered open as Greta approached, and he smiled weakly. "You're the manager, aren't you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Greta nodded, her throat dry. "Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't realize who you were." Henry chuckled softly, though the effort seemed to exhaust him. "Who I am doesn't matter. What matters is who you are." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she stood there, grappling with the weight of her actions. Over the next few days, Henry's condition improved, and the hospital buzzed with talk of the incident. Word spread quickly, and soon the media caught wind of the story. Reporters swarmed the building, eager to learn more about the man who had narrowly escaped death, and the hospital manager who had almost cost him his life. Greta found herself at the center of a firestorm. Some defended her, arguing that hospitals were under immense strain and tough decisions had to be made. Others condemned her, calling for her resignation. Through it all, Greta struggled to make sense of her feelings. She knew she had been wrong, but the reasons behind her actions were harder to unpack. Henry, meanwhile, remained gracious. When asked about the incident, he deflected attention away from himself and instead praised the hospital staff for their hard work. "We all make mistakes," he told one reporter. "What matters is how we learn from them." His words only deepened Greta's guilt. She decided to visit him one last time before he was discharged. Standing outside his room, she took a deep breath and knocked softly. "Come in," Henry called. Greta entered, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. Coulson, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything." Henry regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled. "Apology accepted. But let me ask you something. Why did you hesitate to help me?" Greta hesitated, unsure how to answer. I let my biases get in the way," she admitted finally. "I saw the hat, and I made assumptions." Henry nodded as though he had expected this answer. "We all have biases, Greta. The challenge is recognizing them and not letting them define us." Greta spent the next few days in a haze of self-reflection, her mind replaying the events surrounding Henry Coulson's visit like a broken record. The encounter had unearthed a deep well of discomfort within her, forcing her to confront aspects of herself she had long buried. It wasn't just about Henry. It was about how she saw the world and, more importantly, how she chose to act within it. Her colleagues kept their distance, unsure how to approach her. The nurses whispered in break rooms while doctors gave her polite but curt nods in the hallways. Greta felt like a pariah in the very hospital she had worked so hard to manage. She couldn't blame them. They had seen her at her worst, a moment when she had allowed personal prejudice to overshadow her professional duty. It wasn't something they would easily forget. and she knew she didn't deserve their forgiveness just yet. But the silence wasn't the hardest part. What truly stung was the letter. It arrived on her desk one morning, sealed in a plain white envelope. Greta opened it with trembling hands, unsure of what to expect. The letter was handwritten, the penmanship elegant and deliberate. It was from Henry. Dear Miss Coleman, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to thank you again for the care I received at your hospital. While I am deeply grateful for the medical team's efforts, I am writing to address something more personal. You see, I wasn't entirely unaware of what happened that night. I could feel the hesitation, the judgment, even through the haze of my own pain. But rather than harbor resentment, I find myself compelled to reach out to you, not to admonish, but to understand. We are living in divisive times, Miss Coleman, and it's all too easy to let symbols and affiliations cloud our perception of each other. That red hat on my head, the one that seemed to speak louder than my own voice, has become a lightning rod for assumptions. I don't wear it to provoke. I wear it because it represents a belief in something larger than myself. But that belief is not rooted in hatred or exclusion. It is rooted in hope, in the belief that we can strive for a better tomorrow, even if we disagree on how to get there. I wonder, Miss Coleman, if we ever truly see each other for who we are. I wonder if you might see me differently without the hat. More importantly, I wonder if you see yourself differently now, because despite everything, I see you as someone who has the capacity to grow, to lead, and to make this hospital a place where everyone feels welcome. Thank you for your time and reflection. I hope our paths cross again, under better circumstances. With respect, Henry Coulson. Greta read the letter 3 times, each word cutting deeper than the last. Henry's tone was devoid of anger, his words filled with a quiet grace that made her shame all the more acute. He wasn't asking for an apology. He was offering her an opportunity to change. For days, Greta carried the letter with her, slipping it into her purse or coat pocket as though it were a talisman. She read it during quiet moments, its words becoming a mantra she couldn't escape. Eventually, she knew she couldn't keep it to herself. The hospital staff gathered for their monthly meeting in the conference room, their faces tight with tension. The incident with Henry had cast a shadow over the entire institution, and everyone seemed to be waiting for Greta to address the elephant in the room. She stood at the front of the room, her hands trembling as she clutched the letter. I want to start by saying I failed, Greta began, her voice cracking slightly, not just as a manager, but as a person. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but no one interrupted. Greta took a deep breath and continued. When Henry Coulson came to us that night, I let my personal feelings cloud my judgment. I saw a hat instead of a man, and in doing so I betrayed everything this hospital stands for. She paused, scanning the room. Some faces were sympathetic, others were guarded. Greta unfolded the letter and held it up. This is a letter from Henry. He didn't write it to shame me, though he had every right to. He wrote it to remind me of something I had forgotten. That our job isn't just to treat illnesses, it's to see the humanity in every person who walks through those doors, no matter who they are or what they believe. Greta's voice grew steadier as she read excerpts from the letter aloud. When she finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. No one spoke for a moment until Evan, the young doctor who had intervened to save Henry, stood up. Greta, he said, his tone measured but firm. I appreciate what you're saying, but words aren't enough. What are you going to do to make sure this never happens again? The question hung in the air, and Greta nodded, her respect for Evan growing. You're right, she said. Actions speak louder than words. That's why I've decided to implement new training programs for all staff, including myself, to address implicit bias. We're also going to create a patient advocacy committee to ensure that no one is ever denied care because of who they are. The room buzzed with cautious optimism. Greta knew it wouldn't be easy to regain their trust, but she was determined to prove that she could learn from her mistakes. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Outside the hospital, the media frenzy surrounding the incident refused to die down. Greta's apology and the hospital's new initiatives were widely covered, drawing both praise and criticism. Some commentators lauded her willingness to take responsibility, while others accused her of pandering to public opinion. Greta ignored the noise, focusing instead on the work that needed to be done. Meanwhile, Henry Coulson's recovery became a story of its own. Journalists dug into his background, uncovering stories of his quiet philanthropy and efforts to foster dialogue between opposing political factions. Despite his association with the controversial MAGA movement, Henry was widely respected for his ability to build bridges where others saw only walls. Greta found herself watching interviews with Henry whenever she had the chance. In one particularly moving segment, a reporter asked him about the incident at the hospital. Henry smiled warmly, his face still pale from his ordeal. "We all have moments when we fall short," he said. "What matters is how we respond to those moments. Greta Coleman made a mistake, but she's taking steps to correct it. That's all any of us can do. Strive to be better." His words felt like a lifeline, pulling Greta out of the mire of her own self-doubt. She resolved to meet Henry in person once he was well enough, not just to thank him, but to learn from him. Weeks later, Greta got her chance. Henry had been discharged from the hospital and invited her to his home for tea. Greta arrived nervously, clutching a small bouquet of flowers as a peace offering. Henry's house was modest but inviting, with a well-tended garden and a front porch that seemed made for long, reflective evenings. Henry greeted her at the door, his smile as warm as ever. "Miss Coleman," he said, extending a hand. "Or can I call you Greta?" "Please," she said, shaking his hand, "and thank you for inviting me." They settled into a cozy sitting room where Henry poured tea and offered her a plate of homemade cookies. Greta marveled at his composure. He didn't seem like a man who had recently faced death. "Greta," he began after a few moments of small talk, "I'm curious. What have you learned from all this?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I've learned that it's easy to let fear and prejudice dictate our actions," she said, "and that doing the right thing often means confronting parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore." Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a good start, but the real challenge is applying those lessons every day, even when it's uncomfortable." They talked for hours, delving into topics ranging from healthcare to politics to the power of human connection. Henry shared stories of his own struggles, times when he had been judged unfairly or had let his own biases cloud his judgment. By the end of the evening, Greta felt as though she had gained not just a mentor, but a friend. The following months brought significant changes to the hospital. The new training programs were rigorous but transformative, prompting staff members to examine their own assumptions and biases. The Patient Advocacy Committee, chaired by Evan, became a powerful force for change, ensuring that every voice was heard. Greta threw herself into the work, determined to make amends not just to Henry, but to the countless other patients she had failed in ways both big and small. The experience humbled her, reshaping her understanding of leadership and responsibility. One day, months after the incident, Greta received an unexpected package at her office. Inside was a framed photograph of Henry, standing on the steps of the state capitol with a group of children he had mentored. Attached was a note in Henry's familiar handwriting. "Dear Greta, this is what it's all about, helping each other, lifting each other up, and creating a world where everyone feels they belong. Thank you for doing your part. With gratitude, Henry Coulson." Greta's transformation was a process, not an event. The aftermath of her encounter with Henry Coulson set her on a path of self-discovery and relentless commitment to equity and compassion. Each day brought new challenges as she worked to implement systemic changes in the hospital. These changes were not just structural but cultural, aiming to uproot deeply ingrained habits of thought and behavior that had long gone unexamined. During one session, a nurse named Amara shared a story that struck a chord with Greta. Amara, a black woman, described how patients would often question her competence or ask for a different nurse simply because of her race. "It's exhausting," Amara said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I shouldn't have to prove myself every single day just to do my job, and sometimes it feels like no one even notices." The room fell silent, the weight of Amara's words settling heavily on everyone present. Greta felt a pang of guilt, realizing that she had likely been one of the people who hadn't noticed. "Amara," Greta said, her voice steady but full of emotion, "thank you for sharing that. It takes courage to speak up, and it's on all of us to ensure that no one in this hospital feels invisible or undervalued. I promise you, we're going to do better." Amara's story spurred Greta to action. She launched a series of workshops focused on cultural competency and anti-discrimination practices, inviting experts from outside the hospital to lead the sessions. Participation was mandatory, and while there was initial resistance from some employees, the workshop soon became a turning point. Staff members began to see each other and their patients with new eyes, recognizing the subtle ways in which bias could manifest and taking steps to counteract it. Meanwhile, Greta's personal journey of reconciliation continued. She maintained regular contact with Henry Coulson, who had become something of a mentor to her. Their conversations often wandered far beyond the incident that had brought them together, touching on philosophy, history, and the nuances of human behavior. Henry's ability to see complexity where others saw simplicity fascinated Greta, and she often found herself replaying their conversations in her mind long after they had ended. One afternoon during a visit to Henry's home, Greta asked him a question that had been nagging at her for months. "Henry," she began hesitantly, "how do you stay so calm? So forgiving? I don't think I could have been as gracious as you were that night." Henry leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "It's not about being gracious, Greta," he said. "It's about perspective. People aren't born with prejudice. It's something they learn. And if it can be learned, it can be unlearned. My job isn't to punish. It's to help people see what they're capable of when they let go of fear." Greta nodded, taking in his words. "But doesn't it ever get tiring? Feeling like you have to be the bigger person all the time?" Henry chuckled, a warm, self-deprecating sound. "Of course it does. I'm human after all. But every time I feel that way, I think about the world I want to leave behind. If I can make it a little better, even if it's just for one person, then it's worth it." That conversation stayed with Greta, shaping her approach to leadership. She began to view her role not just as a manager, but as a steward of the hospital's values, someone responsible for cultivating an environment where every patient and staff member felt seen, heard, and respected. One particularly challenging moment came when a high-profile donor threatened to withdraw funding after hearing about the hospital's new initiatives. The donor, a wealthy businessman with staunchly conservative views, argued that the hospital was caving to political correctness and accused Greta of pushing a woke agenda. Greta met with the donor in her office, bracing herself for a difficult conversation. The man, a portly figure with a booming voice, wasted no time airing his grievances. "I've been supporting this hospital for 20 years, he said, his tone laced with indignation. "And now you're telling me my money's going to fund diversity training? What happened to focusing on patient care?" Greta listened patiently, her expression calm. When he finished, she leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice steady, "I appreciate your concerns, and I value the contributions you've made to this hospital. But let me ask you something. What do you think patient care really means?" Hargrove frowned, caught off guard. "It means treating people when they're sick, saving lives." "Exactly," Greta said. "And part of saving lives is creating an environment where every patient feels safe and respected. When someone hesitates to come to us for care because they think they'll be judged or ignored, we've failed in our mission. The initiatives we're implementing aren't about politics. They're about ensuring that every person who walks through our doors gets the care they deserve." Hargrove shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his bluster fading. "I suppose I can see your point," he muttered. "But this whole thing still feels excessive." Greta smiled, sensing an opening. "Change often does. But I promise you, Mr. Hargrove, the work we're doing now will make this hospital stronger, not just for our patients, but for our staff. And in the long run, that benefits everyone." Meanwhile, the hospital's reputation began to shift. Stories of the changes Greta had implemented spread throughout the community, attracting new patients and staff who were drawn to the hospital's commitment to inclusivity. The media coverage gradually shifted from criticism to praise, with some outlets even hailing Greta as a model of transformative leadership. But Greta didn't let the accolades go to her head. She knew there was still much work to be done, both within the hospital and within herself. She continued to attend the Voices Unfiltered forums, often staying late into the night to talk with staff members who needed extra support. She made a point of visiting patients regularly, listening to their stories and learning from their experiences. One evening, as she was making her rounds, she encountered a young man named Miguel who had been admitted for a severe asthma attack. Miguel was an undocumented immigrant, and his fear of being reported to immigration authorities had kept him from seeking treatment sooner. "You don't need to worry about that here," Greta assured him, her tone gentle but firm. Our only concern is your health. Miguel's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, he whispered. You don't know how much that means to me. Moments like these reinforced Greta's conviction that she was on the right path. Each small act of compassion felt like a brick in the foundation of something larger. A hospital where everyone, regardless of their background, could find care and dignity. As the years passed, Greta's leadership became a case study in medical schools and management courses. She was invited to speak at conferences and write articles about her experiences, though she always downplayed her own role, emphasizing the collective efforts of her team. And through it all, she remained close to Henry Coulson. Their friendship became one of the great joys of her life, a constant reminder of the power of grace and understanding. On the anniversary of the night that had brought them together, they met for dinner, a tradition they maintained for years. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? Greta asked one evening, swirling her glass of wine. Henry smiled, his eyes twinkling. All the time. But then I remind myself that every moment, even the difficult ones, leads us to where we're meant to be. Greta nodded, her heart full. She had come a long way from the woman who had once hesitated to help a man in need. And though the journey had been painful at times, she wouldn't trade it for anything. It had taught her the most important lesson of all, that redemption isn't a destination. It's a lifelong process, built one choice at a time. As Greta continued her work, the culture of the hospital began to transform in ways she couldn't have imagined when the journey started. The changes weren't just administrative or procedural. They were deeply human, woven into the very fabric of the institution. Staff meetings became spaces of genuine collaboration, where no voice was too small to be heard. Patients began to sense the shift too, remarking on the warmth and attentiveness that now defined the hospital's care. One day, as Greta walked through the newly renovated pediatric wing, she saw a group of children gathered around a colorful mural. The artwork depicted a vibrant community, figures of different races, ages, and abilities standing together beneath a banner that read, "We're stronger together." The mural had been the brainchild of a patient advocacy committee member, painted by local artists, and funded entirely by donations from hospital staff. Greta couldn't help but smile. The mural was more than art. It was a testament to the values the hospital now embodied. That same week, Greta received a letter from Miguel, the undocumented patient she had reassured months earlier. He had fully recovered and was now working with a local nonprofit that provided medical services to underserved communities. In his letter, Miguel thanked Greta for giving him the courage to seek help without fear and shared how the hospital's treatment had inspired him to help others. "I used to feel invisible," he wrote, "but at your hospital I felt seen for the first time. Thank you for giving me that." Greta folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, alongside Henry Coulson's letter. Both served as powerful reminders of why she had chosen this path, why the work mattered so deeply. Each word reinforced her resolve to continue building a space where such stories could unfold. The hospital's journey also caught the attention of lawmakers, who invited Greta to testify before a state committee about the impact of bias and inclusivity in healthcare. Greta prepared meticulously, gathering data and personal stories from her staff and patients. When the day of the hearing arrived, she stood before the committee with a quiet confidence. "Healthcare isn't just about medicine," she told the room of legislators. "It's about trust. When patients believe they'll be treated with dignity and respect, they're more likely to seek care, follow treatment plans, and take control of their health. That trust saves lives, and it's our responsibility to earn it every single day." Her testimony was met with a standing ovation, and the state soon passed legislation mandating bias training for all healthcare providers. Greta knew it was only one step in a much larger journey, but she celebrated the progress nonetheless. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on a hospital manager denying treatment based on politics? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.